All right, welcome. The mass exodus is happening. That's great. So we are in Matthew 19 and 20 today, and looks like...
Yeah, I'm going to read Matthew 20. I'm going to start in verse 20 and read through 28, and that's page 825 if you're using the chair Bible in front of you. Matthew 20, starting in verse 20. Then the mother of the sons of Zebedee came to him with her sons, and kneeling before him, she asked him for something. And he said to her, "What do you want?" And she said to him, "Say that these two sons of mine are to sit, one at your right hand and one at your left, in your kingdom." And Jesus answered, "How do you know, or you do not know what you are asking? Are you able to drink the cup that I am to drink?" And they said to him, "We are able." And he said to them, "You will drink my cup, but to sit at my right hand and at my left is not mine to grant, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared by my Father." And when the 10 heard it, they were indignant at the two brothers. But Jesus called them to him and said, You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. It shall not be so among you. But whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be your slave. Even as the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many.
Nice work. Thank you, Toby. Appreciate that. So a lot of words there, Toby, but basically what's going on is Jesus is asked a question. The mom says, "I want my boys to be a big deal." He says, that's not how it works. That's kind of what that passage says. All right, we'll get into that. But we're inviting this year. Our theme is invite. We want to invite ourselves and others to Christ, to community, and to ministry. And so our values all support that. And the heart of the gospel is really inviting others to experience it. It's not, the gospel is not good advice like you should do. You should try it. You should do it. It's something you receive as a gift. And that's kind of a shift right there where a lot of people don't get it, okay? But that's what we're doing. And our values are knowing God and his word, experiencing and extending grace, growing in healthy relationships, and then impacting a natural overflow is impacting others near and far, wherever we are, Walmart or Mogadishu, all right, it doesn't matter. But anyway, Jesus invites us today to be his disciples, become spiritually and perceptive citizens of the kingdom of heaven. This passage, chapters 19 and 20, complex, a lot of stuff. Some stuff we've seen before. Again, for the third time, Jesus says, hey, going to Jerusalem, going to be crucified, killed, rise on the third day. And right after that, there's another, I want to be a big deal. So we've seen that before. I'm not going to focus on that. I'm going to focus on chapter 19, but that passage that Toby read fits right in there. So that's what we're doing. Today, well, I'll get to that in a second. So he invites us to be spiritually perceptive citizens of the kingdom of heaven. He wants us to be great in the kingdom of heaven. But what that looks like differs. The disciples have a model of what it means to be great in the kingdom of heaven, and they think it means political power, influence, control, hobnobbing with the rich and powerful. And Jesus has a whole different model of what that means to be great in the kingdom of heaven. All right? So chapter 19 and 20, we're going to zero in on just the passages that talk about kingdom perception of divorce, children, and greatness. That's how it rolls out here, okay? So that's where we're going to be. Matthew is showing them that they don't have to do great deeds or speak great words to be great in the kingdom of heaven. We talked about this last week. Greatness in the kingdom of heaven comes through humble, childlike, dependent faith in the King, staying connected to the King. That's greatness in the kingdom model, okay? In Matthew, he uses the phrase kingdom of heaven 30 times. He doesn't say just the kingdom, because that could be really confusing, but he says the kingdom of heaven. It's a spiritual entity that he's starting, right? And so it's a spiritual entity there. It was misunderstood. He says this in Matthew 5, "Do not think that I've come to abolish the law or the prophets. I've not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law until all is accomplished." Couple things there. He seems to indicate that Scripture, the law and the prophets, there's something that needs to be accomplished. Like the law and the prophets talk about something that's moving forward that needs to be done, accomplished. And Jesus is saying, that's me. I am the one that's fulfilling all the stuff that you should have been connecting the dots to in the Old Testament, and they didn't. We talked about that before. So Jesus fulfills the law, but Matthew writes about Jesus as the Messianic king who's starting a kingdom. Now, right there, they had different thoughts about this, so I've shown you some models about this. In the Old Covenant, there's the Abrahamic covenant in Genesis 12, and that is based on the promise. God promises, I promise, I promise, I promise. 430 years later or so, there is the Mosaic covenant, the Ten Commandments, and the Jews locked onto that, and they just thought, the Mosaic law replaces the promise, and the new norm forever is the law. And that's how they just operate. The Jews thought the law was Lord of all. Okay? So that's how they kind of march through the Old Testament. And then you get to the New Covenant. Jesus inaugurates the New Covenant. What Jesus says is, well, no, the Mosaic law ends with me. I fulfilled it. So now the promise continues into fulfillment, and Jesus says, I am the Lord of the Sabbath. I'm the Lord of the law. The law points to me, and it's done, because its point was to point to me, and I'm here. So put away the law and focus on me. Now, if you're a loophole person, did you just hear that you can go do whatever you want because the law is done? No, because we're renewed inside, and we now, in our regeneration, we desire to do the heart of the law through the Spirit of God, and that used to convict us, and now we can do it. So that's what's going on there. But I don't know if that's helpful. And then in the Old Covenant, the Israelites thought it was just Jews only. God's heart was for the world, but they kind of failed that missionary test. And now in the New Covenant, it's Jews and Gentiles, and that's a conflict you see in almost every page of the New Testament. Maybe I'll say almost every book, okay? Probably a little more accurate, but that's a big deal. All right, so here's Matthew's deal. Matthew says the kingdom of heaven is at hand, near. All right, and that word near means to join two things together. So look at this. Matthew's saying the kingdom of heaven, he's joining the old covenant model of the kingdom. He's joining it, completing it to the new covenant model of the kingdom. That's what he's talking about. Matthew's gospel aims to demonstrate that the kingdom of heaven is near, that Jesus is the king. He invites people to believe Jesus' identity as Messiah, learn from his teachings, live according to the principles of God's spiritual kingdom in anticipation of its full and complete realization. Now, when was that full and complete realization? I've said this before, but remember, when Matthew wrote his gospel in the 60s, AD 60, the church had already been around for 30 years. Most of Paul's life is over. He's done all his writing, first, Galatians, Thessalonians, Corinthians, Romans, all this stuff, pastoral epistles. They're near the end of his life. So Matthew is aware of Paul's writings, but Matthew is writing exclusively to show that Jesus is the Old Testament anticipated Messiah for the purpose of the whole package. Paul is writing his letters with all the nuts and bolts and all the legal stuff about the nature of salvation and justification in the church, and we need them both, but don't get confused about, well, how come Matthew never talks about Paul? Just not his point, okay? Okay, so here's what they thought. If you are in the Old Testament and you hear about the kingdom, your expectations in the future of the kingdom are, well, yeah, the Messiah is going to come. He'll conquer our enemies, because all of the Old Testament says something about enemies, all right? And he'll conquer Rome, and then the Spirit is outpoured, and then people rise from the dead. And so that seems to be, as you are standing in the Old Testament and you look forward, you see these statements about the future of the kingdom, and you kind of collapse them into a single pane. Until what happens is Jesus comes, and he shows up, and it's like, well, the reality is like, well, he came, but then there's talk of another coming, and you do have the outpouring of the Spirit, and he was killed, but he was resurrected, and so it already started. Some of the kingdom already started when Jesus came, but there's a bunch of stuff about the kingdom that hasn't happened yet. So we are between Jesus and the future kingdom. We're here, 2025. And still future to us is the second coming of Christ, which is not the rapture, it's after that, but anyway. And then the general resurrection of the dead. So we're in between here, and so sometimes you'll hear people say, well, this is the already and not yet, all right? And it's an okay phrase to describe it. It started. It's not 100% here. There's more to come, so that's kind of what we're talking about. And this helps, I think, avoid some confusion about what's going on. So Jesus is saying it's a kingdom of heaven, not political. My kingdom is smaller than you think. It's worth more than you think. It's harder to understand than you think. And it's worth pursuing more than you think. And you'll be judged eternally based on what you do with it. Okay? So this is kind of where he's rolling out. All right. So that's kind of where we're at. And again, he's trying to help his disciples understand sort of like the citizen in the kingdom of heaven. How do they think? How do they value? And time after time after time, they just don't get it. In fact, just last week, I was talking to someone, can't remember, and I'm like, the runway's getting pretty short. And is Jesus ever, in his humanity, just mildly panicked? Like, I got no one that understands what's going on. I say that in jest. I know he's in control, but still, it's not encouraging with you got these guys that just continually are 180 degrees off of who you are. Anyway, but he's gracious, and we should find encouragement in that, all right? All right, but the disciples' desires and the Pharisees, what is what they want say about their spiritual perception? Because it's really, really off, and so we're going to look at that, all right? Here's the main idea. Disciples of Jesus have renewed desires and are spiritually perceptive. Our earthly desires and perspectives are not renewed by seeking greatness, but by spending time with the King. That's kind of where we're at. All right, so this is what we're going to be talking about today. At chapter 19 and 20, do you want to be spiritually perceptive? Are you? How do you see marriage and divorce? That's chapter 19. How do you see children, or what in our culture would be the socially outcast? Because in our culture, children are great. We like children, but in their culture, they didn't. So you would have to shift that to just the socially outcast. And then what about money, power, and greatness? What does it mean to have a kingdom of heaven focus on these things? Because the Pharisees and disciples had a focus on divorce, and it's not the heart of God, all right? So we're going to be talking about that. All right, so just because of time, I'm not going to be able to go through every paragraph and verse here. I'm just going to focus on three things: divorce, children, socially outcast, and money, power, greatness. And I just, talking about divorce it's so pervasive, it's so painful. I have studied longer and lost more sleep this last week than any sermon I've ever done. And so I'm probably going to be reading a little more because I want to be so careful to say things correctly. And if you know me, sometimes I can get carried away and just kind of go off, and then I don't want to do that. So I might be a little more focused on what to say. Speaking of that, during our 11 o'clock hour, we're going to have just a kind of a one class, and it's going to be in here. It's the Digging Deeper will be in there now, multi-purpose. We're just going to unpack more questions about divorce, remarriage, stuff like that. So next week, we're going to start another class on hermeneutics. But okay, so verse 1, chapter 19. Now when Jesus had finished these sayings, he went from Galilee, entered the region of Judea beyond the Jordan, and large crowds followed him, and he healed them there. So, I told you before, anytime in my Bibles I've got a place, it's always in pink, so I can quickly see where we are on a map. So from Galilee, he's starting to go down to Jerusalem where he's going to be killed. All right, so this is where we're moving in chapter 19 and 20. And remember, he spends 3 years up in Galilee debating with the Pharisees, and 2 or 3 times they save his life. After 7 days in Jerusalem with the Sanhedrin, he is dead. That tells you the degree of the threat that they perceived him to be. All right? Verse 3. The Pharisees came and tested him by asking, is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause? So that's the verse, okay? This is kind of where he's at. The tested word, same word in Matthew 4 when Satan tempted Jesus. He wants to destroy him. The Pharisees aren't like, let's learn from Jesus. No, they want to destroy him, okay? And so we look at this verse, and they have a question about divorce, but we also read there's Pharisees there. Now, we don't have formal Pharisees in our culture. I mean, if you understand what it is, you could probably find a metaphorical connection to somebody in this culture, but we don't have Pharisees in the professional, hierarchy. So that tells you this culture is different than ours. What do they think about divorce? Why are they saying this? And so we have to get into their head about understanding that, okay? And so this is what we've seen before. There are several voices in the first century. We have religious voices, professional voices, cultural voices, and political voices. And, if you look at that, it's like, well, we have the same voices in our culture, they're just different. In these chapters, we want to focus on the Pharisees. And in the Pharisees, there's a split group. One follows Rabbi Hillel. There's 3 L's, and that group is liberal. This is helpful for the test. Shammai is another group, and it starts with S, and that group is strict. That's helpful on the test, okay? Anyway, so that's kind of where we're going to be focusing on here. But let's first talk about divorce in the Old Testament, God and divorce in the Old Testament. Don and I were buying a house years ago, and we sat down at the title company with like a stacks of paper that you sign. You never read everything. And for all I know, I'm signing over everything I own to this person or to some king in Nigeria or something. But anyway, it's worked out so far. You just sign the papers, and you're happy. Anyway, we're signing these papers, this old grandma grandpa couple at the table. And the guy's like, okay, John and Donna sign here. Okay, Mr. and Mrs. Smith sign here. And they just sat there, froze. And kind of looked at each. I'm like, it's not rocket science, guys. Sign. And they're like, well, we're divorced. We got divorced to save money on our taxes. And I'm like, wow. Okay, then. I've never seen that before. But you're just your normal grandma and grandpa. They're just living together. Everything's fine, except legally they're divorced. Anyway, so that's kind of funny, but divorce is not funny. I mean, I understand it's painful. Who is not touched in some degree by divorce? It is so pervasive. It's pervasive in the church, in our culture. So pervasive that a lot of people are like, I'm not even going to bother getting married. Actually, that's what the disciples say when they hear the teaching. Well, who's going to get married then? Okay, so it's a difficult thing. Well, we read that God hates divorce. And so right there, people kind of go off. But why does he hate divorce? He hates divorce because he loves people. And he hates the pain that people experience, okay? He wants to heal and redeem. But we understand it's a broken world, and he didn't design divorce. We did that. We took his good marriage, and in Genesis 1, we've got man and woman, and it's great. And by Malachi, you've got divorce and alienation and all kinds of problems. And the Old Testament explains how you get there, all right? So he doesn't hate people who are divorced. So that needs to sink into everyone's mind about that as we engage with this issue and the people. But here's the real truth. God hates divorce because he is a divorcee. Did you know that? Did you know God is a divorcee? He has been touched by the shame, betrayal, and pain of divorce. In the Old Testament, God describes himself in terms of a marriage, of fidelity. He says, your maker is your husband. The Lord Almighty is his name. The Holy One of Israel is your Redeemer. He is called the God of the earth. And so God describes himself in relationship to Israel as his husband, and they're the bride, kind of like the church and Jesus, okay? Just in the Old Testament. So when you read in the Old Testament about certificate of divorce, we get that with husband and wife, okay? They got divorced. Here's the legal work. But when you read about God giving Israel a certificate of divorce, you're like, I wasn't expecting that. That's interesting language, all right? But Hosea is full of this. The prophet Jeremiah, they talk about God divorcing Israel. Did you know that? Interesting, right? Because of Israel's idolatry, because they left their husband Yahweh and they married the pagan gods of the nations. And there's language and acts of intimacy here because of the religious system I won't get into, but it's a full rejection of Yahweh and marriage fully with the idols. And because of that idolatry, the covenant is broken, and God, with just reason, just cause, divorces Israel. He says in Jeremiah 3, I gave faithless Israel her certificate of divorce and sent her away because of all her adulteries. Because Israel's immorality mattered so little to her, she defiled the land and committed adultery with stone and wood, idols. In spite of all this, her unfaithful sister Judah did not return to me with all her heart, but only in pretense. Okay. It gets weird, though, in the Old Testament because the model they have about divorce is once you're divorced, you cannot go back to the same husband. That's against the law. Jeremiah 3 says, if a man divorces his wife and she leaves him and marries another man, should he return to her again? And the answer is no. You can't do that. The law is pretty clear. She had broken the covenant, and according to the law, cannot return to the former husband. So, stuck. The law can provide no redemption, no hope, no renewal. Paul calls the law in Galatians weak and worthless. It's weak because it can't break the power of the law, and it's worthless. It has no life, no hope, no regeneration, no inheritance. All right? But God, listen to this, God can do in his grace what the law cannot do. And this applies to divorce. He can do in his grace, in the context of divorce, what the law cannot do, okay? And then Jeremiah 3, it continues. God says, return, faithless Israel, declares the Lord. I will frown on you no longer. I am faithful, declares the Lord. I will not be angry forever. Return, faithless people, for I am your husband. I will choose you. I will bring you to Zion. So there we see the perfect husband coming and pursuing the wayward wife, Israel, us. And that's how we see God's grace doing what the law can't do, what the law says shouldn't be done. But he is Lord of the law. He can do that. It's great, right? So God hates divorce because he's a divorcee. He's seen it. He's experienced. And so here in the context, the question is, the Pharisees say, is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause? Okay, we're going to get into the nitty-gritty here. The question of divorce, that is not an issue. Everybody in the culture acknowledges divorce. Paul, Jesus, the Jews, the Romans. I think the only exception would be the Essenes, the group that did the Dead Sea Scrolls. They were pretty uptight. But anyway, for the most part, the whole culture is like, we don't have a question about divorce. We have a question about when and why. That's the question. For any cause, that's the button, okay? And does the law allow it? Okay, these are religious professionals. Shouldn't they be coming with a question that's a little more helpful? Like Jesus, how can we save troubled marriages? That's helpful. Instead of like, how can we get out really quickly? All right, it's interesting. So that just shows you what's going on. And so verse 4, here's what Jesus says. Have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female? He said, therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they're no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined, let man not separate. All right? Well, he says, have you not read, which is great because these are the Pharisees and they've memorized everything. They're super smart. And so when Jesus ever says, have you not read, you gotta, he's poking the bear. You know what I mean? Where would they read that? Genesis 2. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife. They shall become one flesh, and the man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed. So this is the plan, okay? God didn't create Adam and Steve. He didn't create Alice and Eve. You've probably heard that before. He created one man and one woman together in marriage, all right? Mutual commitment with the possibility of procreation. That is the definition of marriage, right? That's what he made. And if he made it, he can define it and he can explain when it ends. The Pharisees don't have that. That's not in their job description. God designed it so he can comment on it, okay? That's what we see here, all right? What God has joined together. How many, this is a trick question. So you know if you hear that, you don't answer out loud. How many are in a marriage? I didn't say how many people, because that's easy. How many? 3. Man, woman, and God. marriage is not a two-way contract. It's a three-way covenant, all right? God made man, he made woman, he made marriage, and when Christians, when we join in that, we are in a three-way covenant, not just contract, okay? And so God created him, and this is what he does. And the reason it's a three-way covenant, because marriage is a picture of God's good love for us and his church. What depends which part of history you're on with Jesus. But when you're out shopping today and you see a man and woman, a husband and wife, that is supposed to be a picture of God's love for his church. It's supposed to be the sacrificial love, the mutual commitment, the fidelity, the faithfulness. And that's a picture, a walking picture. If you're married, you're supposed to be a walking picture of God and his love for people. But we live in a broken world, and sometimes those things just absolutely blow up and break down. And suicidal murder becomes the question instead of happy marriage. And that's just a reality of a broken world, okay? So, all right. So, Jesus says, what therefore God has joined, let not man separate. Verse 7. So they say, look at verse 7. Well, why then did Moses command one to give a certificate of divorce and send her away? This is great. They changed the words, all right? They're like, wait a minute, if God said don't separate, how come Moses commanded us to separate? That's their thought, all right? And so here's what they're talking about, all right? This is Deuteronomy 24. This is where they're getting it from. This is where Jesus gets his stuff too. But anyway, when a man takes a wife and marries her, if she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, then she departs out of the house. So it's not a command. It's just simply saying this is the situation. If this, then that. Okay. So they change what is allowed. This is just, it's allowed. And they're like, it's commanded. The law says. Now, the key phrase is there, found some indecency in her, and that's where they're going to go crazy with what that means. Okay, so we'll get to that here. But basically, verse 8, because of your hardness of heart, Moses permitted it to divorce your wives. But from the beginning, that's not God's plan. God doesn't build you and say, this is my plan for you, that you will get divorced. That is a result of a fallen, broken culture. And we all have baggage and scars and wounds and fall short with all kinds of brokenness in our culture. And we find healing from that. But, and I'm going to say this kind of carefully and listen to my heart here. Some people think the Christian life is to avoid all, how do I say? If I say avoid all sin, it's like, well, how can you not? But you get so wrapped up in a pharisaical mindset that healing and redemption isn't even part of your life because you're so focused on don't do that, that's wrong, you shouldn't, because they want to not sin, which is noble, but the Pharisees, anyway, so certainly we don't want to sin, but the higher calling is to walk in intimacy with Jesus and receive his forgiveness, which then renews our heart, and we don't want to sin, okay? So it's an internal thing instead of an external thing. External thing. All right. So from the beginning, one man, one woman, mutual commitment, possibility of procreation. No fighting. There's no marital strife in the Garden of Eden at first. There's no arguing over how to load the dishwasher, right? Big things like that. But by Malachi, something is blowing up because of hardness of heart. All right. All right. And so what happens here is because of the breakdown of so many things, Moses takes some civil entities like marriage and he modifies it because of hardness of heart. He does that for marriage. He does that for killing people. He's like, my plan is not to kill people, but you guys are doing it. So here's the law of the blood avenger. This is how you're going to deal with my less than ideal. Here are the steps. And what about slavery? He's like, I don't want this, but since you're doing this, here are the rules about slavery. It's not like, oh, well then let's go do that because we've got rules for this. That's not his heart, okay? So, all right, I read this quote. This is great. in a book talking about how in the Old Testament there is a gracious exception for those hard-hearted where people are being abused. And it says this: if God treated human frailty so graciously in the age of the law and permitted not only divorce but also subsequent remarriage, which it did in the Old Testament, how can we in this age of grace treat divorce and remarriage so legalistically? Because you get all kinds of responses in our culture that are pharisaical in the nature of this, and I'll explain why in a minute. But so the Pharisees asked Jesus, "What do you think about divorce?" And Jesus asked them, "Well, what do you think about marriage?" And then he takes another step and says, "Well, what do you think God thinks about marriage?" So again, they try to trap him, and he always gets out. It's great. He's basically saying, you guys are not in charge of marriage. God's in charge of that. So he eludes their trap. But here's where we can make it more than it is. In our culture, churches, we love God, we love family because God created the family, and in our culture, it's disintegrating, and we can kind of get to this emotional battle mindset and start to look at anything that could lead towards, dissolving the family, and we like, oh, stop it, you can't never do that, because we like this so much. And my invitation is, let's go to Scripture. Are you willing to go to Scripture and let Scripture inform your theological views? Yeah, we should. About 20 years ago, I had to wrestle with my view of divorce because I grew up in a more legalist, not legal, but just super conservative. And I start to study and I go, it doesn't say that. And so I had to wrestle with what I thought because I had grown up a certain way. And there's all kinds of stuff with end times or, spirit this or whatever. Anyway, churches care about marriage. Culture doesn't. So there's a tendency to overreact with our conservative theology and our high view of marriage. Good desires, good things, but what message are we sending? Theology is not a tool for social engineering. We just need to be looking at it as Jesus would want us to do that, okay? All right, so Matthew 19, here's where we're at. The Hillel half of the Pharisees, the liberal group, they have a yoke, or their rule was love. They're flexible, they're kind, Gentiles can be saved, okay? Divorce for anything, and positive Jesus interactions. Anytime you're reading in the New Testament and it says, blah, 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 Jesus and the Pharisees, they agreed or they liked, that's the Hillel people. Because they're going to be favorable about Jesus. These are the guys that Jesus does a miracle, and they're like the strict group is like, hey, he's not from God because he healed on the Sabbath. But these guys, Hillel, are like, yeah, but he still healed. We should probably consider that. That's a big deal, okay? The Shammai group, they're connected to the Zealots, all right? The Zealots are the people that want to kill people, the Roman rulers. Their yoke is strict obedience. Only Jews can be saved. A divorce only for sexual immorality, immodesty, negative interactions with Jesus, okay? Hillel said he said this, he wrote this, you can divorce your wife if she burns your biscuits. One Hillel rabbi said this, in decency, a man could divorce his wife when he found another woman who was more beautiful because his wife was indecent. She falls short. This is Hillel. And they were handing out certificates of divorce faster than they could print them. It was so easy to get divorced. And women were being abused, kicked out of the home into slavery, prostitution, unsupported. And Jesus sees this. And he says, that's wrong. That's not the plan, okay? And so these two guys, obviously over divorce, really, really differed. And that's at the heart of this, because when they say, for any reason, they're trying to trap him, because that's a Hillel statement. Hillel would say, yes, you can get divorced for any reason. Shammai would be like, no, you can't. So they're kind of like, who are you going to side with? And he doesn't side with anybody, okay? If you go to Jerusalem today, there are two streets, one named Hillel, one named Shammai, and they are parallel. They never intersect. That is very much on purpose. They just, they're right there. There's a McDonald's on one, a coffee shop on another. But if you go to Jerusalem, take a picture, send it to me. I'll use it anyway. So they're all locked into the reasons about divorce and which side would Jesus take, and he doesn't do that. He goes back to God's heart for marriage, and he says in verse 9, I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery. So right there, okay, now we have some hard, clear, fast words of clarity. But what he's saying is that you Pharisees, Hillel Pharisees, you're getting divorced over a drop of a hat with such ease. And when you Pharisees, you religious professionals do that, and then there's remarriage, God doesn't recognize your silly little certificate of divorce. It's not over. So your first marriage isn't over, and now you're going to marrying other people. You Pharisees are committing adultery. That's wild, isn't it? That is just wild, okay? And so that's what he's saying. And this phrase right here, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality. So, well, what does that mean, okay? The word is porneia. It is just a broad sexual term of unhealth, sexual unhealth, and it's very broad. And, okay, so what Jesus is instructing them, the kingdom of heaven, marriage was meant to establish a permanent relationship between man and woman, and this easy, casual, lust-based divorce is not part of the kingdom of heaven mentality. He's blasting the Pharisees and the disciples who probably are closer to that than they realize, okay? So here we go, what constitutes sexual immorality? This is what Jesus is thinking about. He gets Deuteronomy 24, some indecency, and he pulls up the sexual morality. So Jesus takes some indecency and narrows it down to only sexual immorality, porneia. We'll talk about it in a minute. And so that's when the disciples are like, yikes, wait a minute. Oh, sure, I want to get married then, because my culture says I can get out, okay? So some indecency literally means a naked thing, uncovered thing, shameful thing, some sexual thing, okay? And so that's what's behind this for any cause. Don was teaching a spinning class at the Y a long time ago, and a guy in the class was talking and talked about his wife, and he said, yeah, she's a starter wife. I'll move on after a few years. I'm like, who thinks that way? Right? Like, it's one thing to think it and be silently ashamed of it, but to be like, yeah, this is my plan. Wow. Anyway, odd. But as I said, the way they're treating women is pushing them out into the culture, and they're being abused. And so Jesus is upholding the covenant of marriage. He's recognizing there is an exception for porneia, for sexual I lost the phrase. I just want to make sure I say it right thing. Anyway, for sexual excess, unhealth. Okay, moving on. Verse 10, then disciples say, well, it's better than we should just not get married. Okay? And then verses 11 and 12, he says, well, some people are called to celibacy. That's hard, but some are. And so that's what that's about. So now let's go practical, okay? First off, divorce is a platform from which you can experience God's grace. You can have a dynamic spiritual life if you are divorced, and if you're single, and if you're married. Okay? It's not always easy. There's difficulties in all of those things, right? So what about those who divorce outside the phrase of porneia, outside of that exception? What about those? Okay? Well, that's sin. If you divorce because she burned your biscuits, and then you remarry, Jesus is like, you're not in charge of making that call. That first marriage isn't over, and now that's sin. But it's sin, and it's not the unpardonable sin, and it's like other sins, different baggage, but other sins. So confess, and if it's possible, seek reconciliation, but obviously that's not always going to happen. You're in charge of your forgiveness, but you're not in charge of the other person's desire to be reconciled. So sometimes you're stuck. I get that, okay? So what about remarriage? The most natural way to read Matthew 5 and Matthew 19 is that divorce for sexual immorality allows remarriage. That's the exception, okay? And so the difficulty there is the word pornea, what it means, and what if my spouse has been unfaithful? You first seek professional counseling. These complex issues, all right? Church isn't always equipped to do those things, nor is it called to. So pursue and exhaust every means. First, get yourself in a place of health with God so you can experience His grace. Pray and seek for reconciliation if that door is at all open, but that may not be. But the end game of all of this is to experience God's grace and reconciliation, genuine repentance. Okay, what about if my spouse is addicted to porn? What about pornography? Does pornography count? I mean, you can hardly drive to church on a billboard and not see pornography. I'm exaggerating, but it's like, oh, divorcing you because you saw, that's right. Then we're like a Pharisee. How easily can I get out? That's not really the driving question. The question is, how can I move toward a healthy marriage? But does pornography ever qualify as sexual immorality? And looking at the word, I don't know how you can say it doesn't. So then, our culture, the average age of exposure is 13 years old for porn in our culture. And so how do we live in a culture? I mean, if you go by that, like 90% of the marriages are legitimately, you can get divorced. I'm being extreme here. But then Matthew 5, Jesus elevates lust in your heart to the level of adultery. Well, now that's 100% of us. You know what I mean? So again, you don't want to look at this through that lens. We want to look at the heart of this, but still, maybe pornography qualifies for divorce if you look at associated behaviors, addiction patterns, character, emotional, physical violence, harm to self, harm to others, duration, reluctance to seek help. Those are some factors in there that would probably be a lens to like, let's move down and with some professional counseling, figure that out. What if I'm a believer and my spouse is not? All right? Scripture's pretty clear on that. Don't be unequally yoked with unbelievers. What partnership has righteousness with lawlessness? What fellowship has light with darkness? What accord has Christ with Satan? What portion does a believer share? So it's like, you get it. It's like, because it's a three-way covenant, it makes no sense to get someone who's walking with Christ and someone who's not. Like, you're not even on the same page. You're bringing in a two-way contract, and this person's bringing a three-way covenant, and it's not even the same blueprint, okay? So that's what's going on with that. Problems in marriage, unhappiness, don't qualify as sexual immorality, all right? So we need to be moving towards that. So the question is, what if I'm a believer, my spouse is not? Stay in the marriage, work towards reconciliation, be a model of grace as best as you can be. However, if the unbeliever in that mixed marriage wants to hit the road, Paul says very clearly, let him go. You're not bound by that, which I understand. You're free to go and you're free to remarry. You're free. All right, what about abuse? Number one, seek professional help. All right, separation is a tool. You don't have to hit the divorce button immediately. I mean, separation is a good tool. If there's abuse, you got to get out, and the police and people, you got to call. There's a great just came to my head right now. Church history of one of the church fathers talking about abuse in the Christian home. And it says something along the lines of, you shall take 3 or 4 stout Christian men and go to the house to talk to the guy. It's just great. You just get this like, dude, what are you doing? I mean, just picture, you know what I mean? That's kind of interesting. So there's that we're calling each other accountable there. But never stay in a physically abusive situation. Separation can be the first thing, all right? But this is not how the Pharisees saw the world. All right, they were treating women like this, and Jesus says this is not how we treat women in the kingdom of heaven. They have a different understanding. They have a different model of commitment. And my disciples are intent on serving others and not satisfying their own desires. Okay. Well, what if you're married? If you're married, great. You're in a three-way covenant. Nurture your walk with God. Commit to your partner. Experience and extend that grace. Even so, there's no guarantees. When you are at a wedding in the future, how do you, or your own wedding, whatever, how does the groom looking at the bride, how do you know that woman or that man is going to even care about Jesus in 5 years, 10 years? You do not know. That's why dating is important, so you can sort of see a trajectory. And you're basically saying, when I do, you're saying, based on my time with you, and I've seen you interact with people, family, whatever, and finances and this and that and trouble and ups and downs, I'm betting your trajectory is going to continue towards Jesus. But you have no guarantees. All right? What about if you're unhappily married? Divorce might look like the best shot, but it isn't. The law cannot do what God's grace can do, okay? So if you're single, you are in a two-way covenant with God, you and God, all right? You're first committed to God, work that relationship, experience His grace, get used to that, and then when another person comes in, you can live an abundant, dynamic, spiritual life. What if you're divorced? You're in a two-way covenant with God, right? Same thing. Receive His grace, learn to extend that to be healed, maybe through counseling, certainly that, and community. But again, you can live an abundant, dynamic, spiritual life. So, Jesus is saying His disciples think differently, and that goes on here with the next passage on children. It's great. People bring children, and the disciples are like, get them out of here. They rebuke them. And again, Jesus does the eye roll, like, guys, this is not how I roll, okay? And then, the mom, what Toby read, I want my kids to be a big deal. And he says, you don't even know what you're talking about. So their desires are warped and twisted, all right? And so here's kind of where we've been. Disciples of Jesus are spiritually perceptive, and they have renewed desires. They don't want to abuse women through self-gratification of easy divorce like their culture. They want to be faithful to God's design for marriage and faithful to their spouse, all right? That's that. They don't want to reject others based on their social status. Children had no social status. They want to welcome non-productive people that society rejects. And third and final, they don't want power to be served. They want to serve others. And Jesus says, I am the model of coming to serve and to give my life for many, completely taking the disciples' expectations and turning it on its head. And that had to be upsetting to their world. So anyway, wrap it up here. Are you spiritually perceptive? Do you have an earthly or kingdom view of divorce, remarriage, socially outcast, like the socially unprofitable, money, power, greatness? These are things that Jesus is pushing His disciples. You really need to come to grips with the kind of Messiah I am, the kind of kingdom I am. And here's our final slide, final questions. What do you want? What do your desires say about what you want? Is what you want what you should want? Okay? Do your desires need to be renewed? Theirs did. Do you want to become spiritually perceptive? Our earthly desires and perspective are not renewed by seeking greatness, but by spending time with the King. That's where we, married, single, divorced, widowed, whatever, walk and work your relationship with a gracious God, receiving His grace. Whatever station of life you're in, you can have a dynamic spiritual life, all right? Staying close to the King, first step. Lord, thank you for your goodness and your grace. Thank you for attending to us in our broken world, healing and offering us solutions in situations that seem hopeless. And we pray that all the pain that we feel, that we would be willing to give that to you and share that. We identify with your sufferings. You were rejected by your own family. You were mocked by those that should have welcomed you, and you were killed violently. And even you understand divorce from Israel in the Old Testament. So I pray that we would come to you freely with our pain and receive your healing and grace, and that we would be able to walk forward in just spiritual health and recover as you lead us. Amen.
We're going to take a moment or two.